Okay, hi everyone. This is Truth Addicts yet again, and it is Dina and Stephanie and me, that's Joanna. And today we're going to be talking about exorcism. And it's such a big subject, but I think what we're going to try and do is kind of bring it down to earth and debunk it a little and try and find out what it's really all about. Because I know there's a lot of literature about it. There's a lot of perhaps misinformation about it. There are movies. So there's this idea that it is to do with some priest doing a ceremony, and that there's a written ritual that goes with it in the Catholic Church, that is. But what where does it come from? What is it? Why is it needed? And I want to put forward an idea, and we're going to look at it, and we've got some stories to tell. And that is that it really is all about replacing a lower energy with a higher one. So that's what we're trying to get to. And to say that, some of those movies, they are based on fact. In fact, that famous movie, The Exorcist, was based on a true story, though it was a boy who went through that process rather than a girl. And so I don't know what else is not accurate. But there are stories in the world about people being possessed. And what I want to bring forward is that in a way, we are all possessed by something. Some good things, some not so good things, some things we want to get rid of, and some things we would like to invite into our lives. So, for example, if someone's addicted even to cigarettes or something that's maybe not that serious, it still is, in a way, a possession by an energy. Because energies, if you've been listening to our dialogues for a while, you know that energies are very real and that they live with us, and that we can connect to higher energies or lower energies. It all depends on how we think, how we behave, what our purpose is, what our principles are, and we can change that. So I also want to put forward the idea of, in a way, a self-exorcism, or an understanding that would bring a person to the ability to exchange a lower energy for a higher energy. So that's by way of introduction. I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Um, I actually have I just realized I have quite a potent story about this. I know we're trying to go a bit more grassroots, and I definitely do think we should go there. But one story from my life, which I think really encapsulates it, is I had, I'm going to condense the story. I basically had a friend of a friend invite me to a party. And I didn't know this woman, but I was at a point in my life where I really wanted to make new friends. So I went along to her house. And although there was really nothing wrong there, it was a very nice house. She was a very nice person. The food was delicious. The drinks were flowing. The music was good. But for me personally, I couldn't wait to get out of there. And I sort of stayed as long as was polite and then made my excuses. And when I got home that evening, I basically sort of did my nightly routine and just went to bed. And one thing I'll say is I didn't shower. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. So just as I was about to fall asleep, all of a sudden, this big, black, oily, textured bolt of energy came and sat on my chest. And it was terrifying. And it said, get up right now and go kill yourself. With a force and a power that was it wasn't just words. There was a force and a power behind it. And if I had been someone who was much more weak-willed or weak-minded, I would have considered it. It would have gotten into my system. And at that moment, interestingly enough, unconsciously, everything in me sort of did this flare of all of my energy and light and pushed it out the window. And then I literally fell instantly asleep. I think I used up all my energy basically and passed out. So the next morning I woke up feeling very hungover. I hadn't been drinking. It was that I had exhausted all of my energy to get that thing out of my house, out of my aura. And but the one thing I knew was that I knew I'd gotten rid of it, but I didn't think that I had disbanded it, or, you know, I knew I'd gotten it out of my energy, but I didn't know where it was going. And I thought the odds were good that it would go back to where it came. And so I picked up the phone and called the friend of mine and said, your friend has been considering suicide for a really long time. And I knew that because of how big and intense that energy was. I knew that somebody had been feeding that for a long time for it to be that intense and that powerful. And my friend actually said to me, oh, no way. Like, didn't you see how big her house was and how good the food was and how happy she was and how everybody was having a good time? And I said to her, yes, I did see all those things, but here's what I know. Your friend has been contemplating suicide for a very long time, because I picked it up from her house. And, you know, it's up to you whether or not you want to approach her. I don't know her well enough to approach her. And so she said, well, I don't think I will. But she called me back an hour later, and clearly she had changed her mind. And she said, oh my God, you're right. She was so relieved that she could finally talk to someone about it. And in fact, for several months, she'd been feeling very suicidal, and just didn't feel like there was anyone that she could talk to. And so these are very real things. There's a lot to know about them. There's a lot to understand about them. So I'm really glad that we're opening this up.
Well, thanks for that. That's a powerful story. I've got a story I'm going to tell. It's a bit lighter, but it's also about energies and how we can connect to energies, and that how they're out there, and to be watchful and to know that not necessarily they're ours. Because you could have easily thought, oh, that's me, but you knew better, which is great that you had that knowledge to recognize that that wasn't you. And in fact, you recognize where it had come from. Well, this is, I was working in Canada. So this was in Toronto at a company, and I wasn't very happy there. And I thought I should look for another job. And I made a list of what I wanted. And I wanted a better pay, closer to home. I wanted a gym nearby. I wanted a nice boss. And yeah, oh yes, and I wanted to be able to work with a Mac rather than a PC, because in those days, the PCs weren't working very well, at least not at the job that I had before. Anyway, I got all those things. I found a job. In fact, the gym was actually in the building where I was working. So I was really happy, but there was one thing I forgot to ask for, which is longevity. So what happened is about 6 months in, they decided to downsize the company, and they fired my boss. And because I was her assistant, she was the VP of marketing, they fired me too. And so, and also my husband had just come out of work, because we were building an education society, teaching people about energies. And we had decided that he would come out of work, and now I had lost my job. But I thought, well, that's okay. I don't know whether you know how that happens, but they just kind of get you to get your things and they march you out. And so it's quite dramatic. Like one minute you got a job, you're sitting at a desk, and the next minute you're being marched out of the company and never to come back. So I walk out with my box, with my things, and I could feel this cloud of energy kind of descending. And it had things with it like, you're a failure, you can't keep a job, you're no good, you'll never find another one. And it had depression in it. And so I was beginning to kind of come under that cloud and be affected by it when I realized what was happening. And what I realized was that there's a whole like bank of energy of everybody who has ever lost their job and fallen into depression and been upset about it. And there was this kind of cloud. And once I realized that, I was able to back it off. And in fact, once I got home and I spoke to my husband, we decided that we would make it work, that we would both come out of work. And we went out for dinner, invited some friends, and went out and celebrated. And that really caused this cloud to back off. And it never came back. But again, knowing that that wasn't my depression that was coming down on me, that it was everybody else's, makes all the difference, because I was able to back it off in an effective way.
That's a great story.
Sure.
So what this is basically saying to me is that what we're saying is that we're processors. Human beings are processors, and we're processing all manner of energy all the time. We're either processing happiness, or we're processing curiosity, or we're processing frustration, or we're processing stress. But no matter what it is, anytime during the day or night, what we're doing is processing something. And that there are certain very definite levels of understanding and consciousness about that fact. And so to understand exorcism is to understand a little bit more about energy. What is fine energy? What is coarse energy? To understand a little bit more about how each one works. One of the things we've said here before on Truth Addicts, which I think is such an incredible thing to know, is that high, fine, good energy only comes when you invite it. But low, scary, coarse energy will invade. If there's any opening, it'll come right in. And so it's not something that you choose, it just happens to you. And there's the understanding about fine and coarse energy to do with the speeds of it, to do with the temperature of it. So maybe we want to talk a little bit more about the difference between the two and some of its characteristics.
Well, one way to discern whether it's a high energy or a low energy is, how do you feel? Do you feel energized? Do you feel inspired? Do you feel like there's something has elevated your sense of yourself and how you think about things, or not? I mean, if you meet, like, say you meet somebody that you haven't met before, and after the meeting you go away, how do you feel? Do you feel that was a great meeting? The person made you feel happy, made you feel better, made you feel energized? In that case, you'll probably want to meet again. And it's the same with energies. Energies will make us feel either happy and inspired and all those good feelings, or they will cause us to be depressed and at the extreme end of the bar, things like suicidal and very depressed. But there's a whole gamut in between, between low and high. So it's really, I think, using your feelings as tools of recognition of what kind of energy is around. Because when you went to that party that you mentioned, you felt that there was something wrong with the energy. You wanted to get out. And do you feel that way when you go into a room, or when you meet people, or when you're on a bus, or when you're on in a public place? Do you want to get out? Do you feel kind of dirty and want to go and have a shower? So that would be an indication of what level of energy you're dealing with.
I tend to feel forgiving when I'm clean. And I tend to not, my thoughts tend to not be so personal when I'm clean. I have more of a care for other things. And I guess a kind of confidence. Able to remember the reasons why I'm doing something, like my own reasons. They're upfront when I feel clean. I'm not policing of others when I feel clean. I recognize that most of other people's behaviors don't have anything to do with me when I'm clean. And when I'm not clean, I can think that something has something to do with me which just doesn't. I can remember that there's two sides of truth. For example, I was reading a little bit of what a college, he got fired actually, but in 1991, a college professor was studying some truths about how people were behaving. And he started listing the truths. And as I saw the truths, I was like, yes, monsters, devilish. That's like, wait a minute. These things are true, but that's half the truth. When I'm clean, I remember there's another half of truth. And these things together make a whole story.
Okay, so this story takes place in China, and I visited Xi'an, which probably a lot of people know is where the terracotta soldiers are. Right. So, of course, I went on a little tour, and I went to the terracotta soldiers, and there's a lot of tourists there, and these big pits. You might have seen the pictures, and thousands of these terracotta soldiers lined up. Apparently, the emperor who commissioned them wanted to take them to heaven and conquer heaven. So he was a megalomaniac, he was a narcissist, and very cruel too, because a lot of the artists that he commissioned to sculpture these individual soldiers, he actually put to death, as well as several of his concubines. So really bad guy. Anyway, that was what it was, and we went around Xi'an and went to a lovely Buddhist temple, and they have medieval walls around the old city. We went on an excursion along the walls. So it was a whole day. It was great. And the next day I was going to the airport, and I was flying out, and the guide suggested that he would take me on the way to the airport to this burial place of this emperor, which was completely in a different location. So I said, sure, yeah, I'd love to see that. So we go there, and it was very different, although again, there were these pits with figures, but they were very different. They were much smaller than the terracotta soldiers. They were like 2 feet, 3 feet high, and they were human clay figures. And they used to have, apparently, wooden arms, but the wooden arms had rotten and fallen off. So there were all these human figures made of clay that were armless. And there were pits of them, and animals and cows and pigs and horses, and all made out of clay. And apparently, again, these were buried with the emperor himself and with some of the concubines. So we go in there, and first they show you a little movie about the history of it, and then you go around, and this particular display was very empty compared to the terracotta soldiers, which was totally busy. So there weren't many people there, and the lights were down because they were trying to keep the place preserved. So so the guide kind of told me to just follow the arrows and read the inscriptions, and he let me go on my own. So I went around, took maybe about an hour, because there's quite a lot of these pits. Some of them you can walk over because there's glass sheets over them. So it was very curious. Anyway, I come to the end of it, and suddenly I feel a great pain in my jaw. And I'm thinking, what is this? I couldn't work out what was happening. And then a great pain in my chest. It's like something is sitting on my chest. And I could hardly breathe. So I found the guide, and I said, look, let's go now. And so I don't know if he picked anything up. I didn't say anything because I was in trouble breathing. And so then he drove me to the airport, and I realized that this emperor had buried quite a few of his concubines alive. And I thought, if you're buried alive, maybe he had them gagged, and and then they would throw earth on you, and you would feel that as a weight in the chest. So I realized that I was probably picking up the energy of what happened to these women. And there were quite a few of them, because he had hundreds of concubines. I mean, he killed about 60 of them, I think.
Oh.
Horrible. Anyway, so I get to the airport, and he kind of couldn't wait to get rid of me. He said, oh, I can't park here. And he just kind of shoved me out and drove off like something was after him. And I thought maybe he picked something up, because I felt there was something with me that wasn't nice at all.
Right.
So I go through security. I bought myself a cup of tea, and I sat down. I was just praying. And I was just praying not to die there, because I felt that I was going to die. I thought I was getting a heart attack. And I just thought, I can't die here. I must go home. And I'm praying and praying and praying. And suddenly this incredible feeling of elation came over me, and all the pain lifted. It's like an angel came. I don't know what it was, but it was certainly something to do with healing, because suddenly all this lifted, and I felt just very happy to be alive and be okay, and that everything was going to be all right. And I felt that was an exorcism, that something came and replaced that horrible energy with something much higher and better and inspiring. So that's my story.
So also speaking about clean, and we mentioned earlier about, we've mentioned about shower now twice, because one of the tools that we have to actually help ourselves choose the process that we want is a shower. Because what can happen throughout the day is your aura starts to collect all kinds of different energies. And mostly the energies that that we want to choose, how do I explain this? Okay, so I'm trying to say a kind of a big concept, which is that you're going to feel your best and you're most energized when you're processing what you've self-decided. But if as you're going through the day, you're picking up all these different energies from all over, from other people, thoughts that really aren't yours. And it can sort of muddle the system. It can also heat the system. But if at the end of the day, you take a nice shower, the water will actually take anything that is sort of hot or not connected to you, something that you're not actively processing, and it will just wash it right off. And you'll feel like, that's why a shower feels so amazing, and you feel like you have such a clean slate. It's also why, as Joanna was mentioning, when you get around really low and coarse energy, you feel dirty. Like, I always know when I'm around really coarse energy because I feel like my hands are so dirty. and I just can't wait to wash them. And even at sometimes my fingers will swell. So you can have actually even very physical reactions to coarse energy. Also, your feet will sweat. The other thing about a sort of knowing and feeling coarse energy is that coarse energy is very hot. It's funny because it's the opposite of what a lot of people say. Often people will say that very coarse energy is freezing cold. And I think in the movie The Exorcist, they had the temperatures in the room as freezing cold, but that's actually not, that's flipped around. There's a reason why they call hell this very burning inferno, because coarse energy is incredibly hot, and very fine energy is actually incredibly cool. It's like a cool breeze. And often if you're in a very highly religious process, you can become like freezing cold.
Yeah.
So bring a sweater. The only thing I can say about that is bring a blanket, bring a sweater. Because it's worth it. You don't want to exit that cold because it's doing beautiful things to your spirit and soul. But yeah, just a couple other little bits and pieces about being clean, because as Dina was really illustrating, the intelligence that you can have and the sensitivities that you can have when you're clean and your energy is clean, it's a big difference.
Yeah, and the other thing is, going on from what you've said, is that you kind of keep control of who you are, and there's an integrity with that, and there's a purpose, and you have certain boundaries. And when you sometimes lower your standards and you let perhaps somebody else persuade you to do something that you know is wrong, we've probably all done that when we were younger, for sure. Don't you feel like something gets in and you don't feel, like you said, you don't feel clean? And what goes with it is that you gave over your power to somebody else, and you gave up your power. Whereas if you keep your power and you keep your boundaries and you decide, no, I'm not going to do that, there's a sense of self-control in it too. And I think that goes with being clean as well. Very important, because I think our health depends on it. Because when we let lower things in, they can bring with them disease and headaches and all kinds of unpleasant manifestations, like you mentioned about how you felt and the feeling that your hands are dirty or that your feet swell. But there's all kinds of changes that can happen physiologically. So really important to keep to your own standards, keep to what you know is right, because I think we all do know what is right.